Are we? We are live.
We are live.
Every time we go live, we're like, click. Oh no, there's another click. And then, anyways,
There's
um,
that little lag. It's aside from that,
exactly.
StreamYard's amazing. Absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it's one of the better tools. Anyways, without all that, welcome everybody to our, I don't know, fourth or fifth stream already
Yeah.
about CMS evaluation and how to buy it and all that stuff. You can actually find the content that we created here on the Uniform website. So I'm here with Mark. Mark, talk to us about yourself for the people that are new.
Hello, I'm Mark Demany, and I do a bunch of stuff for Uniform, but right now I'm doing the live stream with Tim.
That is one of the better introductions I've ever heard. This is proper Friday morning for you, right?
It is, yes.
Exactly. All right. So today, let's open our agenda. So in the context of choosing a composable tool or CMS and how to evaluate what you have to buy, there's a few things you have to consider. And today we're talking about SDKs, and specifically, it's like these software development kits for the front end. And so, first of all, we'll talk a little bit about what SDKs are, but then also all the things that we think these SDKs need. And then it's up to you when you evaluate whatever CMS you're going to buy, if you need these things, right? And then there's a few things that we would love them to have, but that's not always true. And then, of course, we work at Uniform, so we want to also discuss like how does the Uniform SDK work, and how can you use Uniform as a proxy towards these CMSs from your front end. And so, yeah, there's lots there. So, Mark, what is an SDK?
An SDK stands for a software development kit. And beyond that, to your point, there's things that we would expect an SDK to have, but beyond, there's no real official definition of what's in an SDK.
Exactly.
So I think that is what it stands for. But really, the idea is that it is a bunch of code and potentially documentation and potentially examples that are written for a specific language or framework that interact with some underlying system. And the reason software vendors do this is to make it easier for you as a developer to connect with that system. And in some cases, there's things like helper functions. In some cases, there's things that do a lot of sort of boilerplate code for connecting to just make things easier for you. And in some cases, it actually goes very far into real full built out examples for a lot of common use cases. And so there's a lot of variation there. But in general, that's really the purpose of an SDK.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And in the end, you probably don't need an SDK if you can just talk to an API. If you need an SDK for a CMS, there's something special there. So it means it's something might be hard to render, or there's something special going on, which doesn't mean it's a bad thing. But generally, if something has an API and you are one of those people that love to go deep with code, you probably don't need that SDK. Right? There are some examples, like, for example, when you take Algolia and their instant search, you probably want to use their SDK because it gives so much richness to your faceted search interface. Why build that yourself if it exists, right? But then for other things like, querying a contentful or a GraphQL type of thing, you just query, get the data, and do whatever you want. Anyway, so let's see in our agenda what the next point is, because there are, if we look at point number 2, there are different ways nowadays that we render, that we can render front ends. And maybe we can just talk a little bit about how you can render front ends to different approaches, and then if that actually matters for SDKs or not. So what do you think, Mark? Does it matter?
I think it matters a little bit. You look at examples from vendors. I think it matters a lot for getting started quickly and understanding it. I think, when you were saying earlier, if there's a good API, you don't necessarily need an SDK. Somebody like me who's developer-ish, former developer, business user, whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
I think I depend a lot more on those things to get started. So,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
for example, I'd go to Contentful and say, right, I want to try Contentful, with this programming language, and chances are it would have that SDK already enabled and already have some example code. And
Yeah.
so I think for somebody like me, that helps a lot. And that helps a lot in the evaluation process in particular.
True. Very
Um,
true.
to your point though, once you're actually getting in production, you may rely on that SDK less, right? Because you
Yeah.
may say, do we really need it? It's one more dependency. What types of queries are we actually doing? And so you may kind of use it as a little rocket booster and discard it later on,
Yeah.
potentially, right?
And what actually, that came to mind, what is interesting here in the different ways that you can render websites. So let's go over these, and I'll talk about certain SDK features that you might want to think about differently based on different ways of rendering. And let's keep this as simple as it possible, because we can talk for 5 hours about how you can render websites nowadays. I think the simplest way we can say is you can render a website or a page at runtime. So the user hits the browser, types in the URL, goes to the server, it comes back with whatever that URL signifies. So that's server-side rendered. And then on the other spectrum, the other side of the spectrum, you have a single page application, which is
Mhm,
fully JavaScript. So when that URL hits, it actually goes only into the browser, and the JavaScript renders your whole front end. And then inside there, after that JavaScript is loaded, it starts to query APIs and whatever. And then data comes back and it populates. And both of them work fine. You just have different approaches
mhm,
for them. And then you have many things that are in between, right? The one that we used a lot up until recently is you might actually not do SSR, but you might statically render on build all your pages.
mhm,
So when somebody hits a URL, a static HTML is literally shown, and then it gets enriched or hydrated with JavaScript. And then it becomes a single page app after the first subsequent click that you do in that website. Because SPAs or single page apps are great for not having to reload the full browser. You click on something and only 1 or 2 bits change.
mhm,
That feels a lot faster. You can do animations, you can do a whole bunch of fun stuff with that. So the one in between is basically a Jamstack site. Yes, that word still exists. And then subsequent clicks hydrate whatever that page is, and then things start to happen more smoothly. As of recent, there are other approaches too now, where you have React server components and you also have Next server components now, where essentially everything is server-side rendered again, but with Node.js or React or whatever they choose for that. And there might not be a JavaScript variation on the client side for that component.
mhm,
But you can do that. And companies like Astro pioneered that, where you could have a pre-built site, and then sometimes it's only backend component, sometimes it's also front-end component. You can call this islands architecture. And then when Next and React came in, is where it's a real server-side component that just get cached on the server. And you can say cache this for 5 minutes or 10 seconds. So it is a server-side rendered on runtime page, so highly dynamic, but then gets cached and it's hyper fast. And so it feels like a static page again. And then you can choose this one is client side and this one is not. This one loads with an animation. And so as you can see, and it's huge. And there are many approaches that we shouldn't talk about now because we just confuse ourselves and others. But with this in mind, there's something very important to consider with these SDKs, because generally these front-end SDKs are built in JavaScript, TypeScript, Node.js, stuff like that. And they come with a lot of information in the JavaScript file that you need to be able to run them. And if you have something like a Jamstack site, right, where you have a static site that's rendered, and you're using that SDK to query a page and grab some rich text and convert it into something, all that stuff, you need the SDK for. But because these are JavaScript packages, they also go into the bundle that is then sent to the user on the front end. Because when you are in that single page app and you click on something, it has to be converted into that next page with a payload that it needs. So it needs that SDK again. But what that means is if that SDK is huge, For every time you go to a page the first time, you have to actually download, parse, put in memory, and cache that whole SDK. And maybe that SDK was meant to only be used on the server side.
Mm-hmm.
And if you only did a server side rendering, it would never end up on the client side on the user. So potentially the way you render your site, you have to be pretty smart about where do I put my SDK and how much is going to the end user of that whole toolkit that I might only use to render one page or query one thing.
Yeah, I think the point of this is.
Oh, thank you for pushing me towards a point. Thanks.
I was going to say, I think the point of it is, one, it's fairly complicated, and it's understanding how important an SDK is
Yeah,
also related to understanding which of those approaches you choose. Client side, server side, somewhere in between,
exactly.
and whether the SDK is suited for something like that as well. Um,
Well,
and
I've had it,
then,
for example, where I used, I think back in the day, it was Prismic CMS that I used.
mhm,
And it's not here to say Prismic SDK is not good. It's actually one of the best out there. But I didn't realize what Nuxt was doing with my website, how much was pushed to the front end and how much was staying in SSR, where I was rendering these pages to be static, right? And I didn't realize it, but I was pushing a lot of logic, even unit tests, a bunch of stuff to my front end client,
mhm,
making the JavaScript files heavy. You know what? When you think about having a fast connection and fast devices, it's not that bad to have. But when you then go to a website where they don't do it, it's so fast, it's crazy.
mhm.
And what we also should realize is that I think 80% of the world does not have the internet like you and I have it here. And so loading just a React application in Italy on the
Mhm.
countryside takes you 20 seconds.
Yeah, I
Imagine
think
putting
that's
a whole SDK in there. There's no need.
yeah, and I think um, one of the things that Google has done very well with Lighthouse scores is really reflecting that reality. They're basically saying, hey, when you're looking at the performance of a page, we're assuming that it's going to be an older device running
Oh
on
yeah,
a
exactly.
mediocre internet connection, and that's really why they're doing it. Is
Exactly.
to your point, yes, you might have a really good internet connection, wired up in your house, but certainly in the Canadian countryside, and probably the same for the French countryside, in
Mhm.
mobile internet is not that great.
Exactly.
So
I'm running on that now though, so pray for me. I think it's good. I can see the antenna pole right there outside, so
oh, that's not too bad.
we're okay. No, but like even when I gave that example of just now, I removed the rich text rendering SDK because
Mhm.
I don't need that in the client side. I only needed to render my static pages, and I removed a few other things. And I think I removed 50% of my front end client bundle, making my website that much faster.
Yeah,
So
no, that's
take this into consideration. How much of that SDK do you push to your users?
yeah. I think that's a good lead in to talking about what an SDK typically or often contains. So you'd mentioned stripping out a few elements that SDK provided.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other things that you talked about. Preview SDKs, how you handle rich text. Why don't we go through a few of the examples of
Yeah.
what a CMS SDK often contains, and then similarly at the end of that, when we talk about things like docs, examples, and starters, I'm actually going to bring up a browser and look at a particular vendor
Oh,
examples and kind
nice.
of
Yeah.
talk through
How they do it.
how they do it. Yeah,
Awesome.
exactly. So,
So I wrote down a list just now of what I
mhm.
think has to be in there, or not has to be, but these are
Should
things you typically
ideally.
see. Yeah, and you know what? Certain CMSs you just don't need it because they don't offer certain features. But
Yeah.
for example, certain CMSs come with a very rich media management and delivery API. Well,
Mhm.
use an SDK for that, right? And
Yeah.
then others, like Prismic, has a Prismic image tag in all languages that has an amazing piece of SDK kit behind it. But then when you go to others, they don't have that at all because you handle your images yourself, right? So there's different choices you can make. And so let me just read out my list here. I'm going to put that in in the chat here for others if they want to see that. Just put it in here. So essentially, we have a query builder to just say, give me all content types of type blog and order it like this, and then follow the first connection in it, something like that.
Yeah.
Then
Well, and maybe even do things like pagination.
exactly, all that is
Maybe
in
even
there.
allow you to do some filtering. Some, sometimes that's on the SDK level, and
Yeah, a bit of search, stuff
yeah.
like that. Exactly. So that one is the core. Every SDK will have this.
Should.
Yeah, should have this. And then there's another one that is very interesting. We see more of that recently, where you need somehow people in headless CMSs want to preview their work. And so there sometimes are different types of SDKs, different packages inside a bigger SDK perhaps that allow you to do preview. And so we have different approaches to this. Like if you look at the likes of Storyblock, that's fully preview, really awesome. They actually have a Vue.js or a React component that you put on the page, and that will help you render the components. But because they own that component, they can actually attach their preview to that, and you can do drag and drop and all that stuff. And so that's a separated bit that comes kind of out of the box with them. But then when you go to content.ai, for example, they have a much more agnostic approach. You just add an ID or a certain attribute on HTML. The CMS in preview mode understands these attributes and then renders some preview stuff for you, which is another very good approach. And then you have Sidecore that has something in between, right? And so preview SDKs are things. If you have preview, you likely will have some form of preview SDK, because you kind of just want to, when something changes, you might want to send a post message or a webhook or something to refresh the page that you're looking at. And it also has to know you're in draft mode, not in published mode. So all that stuff comes with the preview API. Well, then we have another big one, rich text SDK, because every CMS will have a rich text. And for a long, long time, you would just get HTML back from these things. And that HTML that you get back, you would have a lovely JSON structure and then a big chunk string of HTML. And that would never work with whatever you had going on, CSS. It was nasty.
Well, and also even like mobile applications really just couldn't work with it well at all.
Oh, exactly.
And so,
it's a one-channel kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
And so nowadays, what these systems do is they have a little language they created for, this is a paragraph, and this word is bold, and there's a link here, and then it's a whole JSON structure. It's like a graph of whatever that rich text was when you were editing it, and it's just a JSON language. And so you could parse that language yourself and build HTML, or you just use their SDK because it's exactly built for that. And so that's another piece of kit that you really want, because the lovely bit for good CMS is in here. Like Contentful has a really good one. Prismic has a great one. I know Casey CMS has a really good one. I haven't seen many others here, but they would actually say, if I hit a P tag or an image, write me a little piece of code that can hook into it, and then you can write your own image tag with your own lazy loading and your own fun thing.
Yeah.
And that's actually, then it becomes very interesting and important, because an SDK should not say an image always has a P tag around it. That's a silly thing to do. Well, Contentful does it. I hope, by the way, sorry to say it like that, they used to do it. I cannot say if they do it now, but they used to. And stuff like that just makes no sense. Like you have a UL with a list and they put a paragraph around it. Why?
Yeah, I think it's probably worth saying rich text handling is probably one of the things that people don't think about a lot, but it's potentially one of the biggest sources of problems. It's like
I would say
it's like an iceberg, right?
Yeah, it's the hardest things in CMS and web development, in my personal experience, is images and rich text. The two most basic things ever are the hardest to deal with.
Well, and I think the third hardest is the next one on your list, which is link building.
Link building, yes, that's yet another one. And so, in my personal experience, sometimes what you'll see, you might in a CMS link to another content type, right? And you might, and either you say, hey, this is a link with a little button that just goes somewhere, or it might be a connection to another thing. And you might want to render a link for that in your front end, like a button to click. Your headless CMS will never know the way you can link to something else, because your URL it should be agnostic, right? You can have a web interface, then we can have an iOS interface, we have a refrigerator. Those have different ways of linking. So if you have a bit of SDK kit to help you to create the link for the channel you're dealing with, that is really important. And I don't see this coming back too often. So Mark, do you know any SDKs that give you this other than the one I know, which is Prismic?
I don't think so, because to your point, a CMS generally doesn't understand the full context of where that item is being used.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I think there's some that kind of combine a little bit of rich text and link building potentially.
Exactly.
So
Yes,
like,
exactly.
Contentful allows you to insert sort of content from one item into the rich text of
Oh
another
yeah,
item.
I've seen that. That's actually pretty cool. Yeah,
Which
Casey
is
CMS is the
which is
same.
pretty cool. Yeah. Not every CMS enables that. But yeah, I mean, it is. I think it will become more and more important
Well, it really
over
depends,
time.
because it's one of those like lovely ease of use things that
Yeah.
that content editors just want. They want to be able to just select something in a rich text field and make it a link to another thing. And somehow the developer just needs to deal with that, even though maybe a CMS shouldn't be doing that at all. But that's for another time, right? We need to
Yeah.
kind of figure out where that sits and how idealistic do you want to be. Look back at our previous session where we talked about this in depth. So, and then the last one that I have on my list here that I wanted to talk about is like external sources and how they integrate. Because certain CMSs would, let's say, do an integration to a commerce system. And then when you query that, it only gives you back the IDs of these items. But sometimes it actually caches a bit more data on its own CMS. Or it's just different way of pointing at data. And sometimes you have SDKs to help you and sometimes you don't. And so this one is relatively light. I'd rather have an SDK that doesn't think about this, so I can just use the SDK of that commerce system to query these APIs items. That sucks. Let's be fair. I don't want to have 5 SDKs in one front end to be able to preview in my commerce, preview in my front end, link to this. Like that is not something you want. Don't want to glue shut your whole code base. So that's a little hint. We're going to talk about uniform soon.
Yeah. Well, and before we talk about that, though, I think it is worth noting that there are some CMSs that really specialize on that commerce
That's
integration
true.
use case.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth considering that, like, yes, if your commerce, if you are specifically doing stuff around commerce and integrating there, systems like Amplience make sense. They do
Yeah,
a lot of
Amplience,
hooks
is
to,
crazy good what they do.
yeah.
Like, for example, search is always a hot topic in CMSs. They're not great at it because they're not built for it.
Yeah.
And then Amplience just decided, you know what? We'll just give you the best search ever by integrating Algolia. Done.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So they have this whole shopping approach. They call it shopping, I think, nowadays rather than commerce. And they do that extremely well. So it's also the choice of, what does your CMS want to do?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in some cases we're sort of hinting at the quality of the SDK, and where SDKs focus what they do is often very closely related to the functionality of the underlying CMS. I
Exactly.
think, this is one of those things. If you're a vendor that's building some specific function into the CMS, part of that completeness is building that function into the SDK for people to take advantage of it. It doesn't make a lot of sense to develop something really deep around image handling or commerce handling, and unless you also have the SDK enabling that use of that function.
Exactly. Totally true. And so I think some other things that I didn't really talk about yet that SDKs need is documentation. Let me
Yeah.
just say that again. Documentation that's up to date. Sorry, I had to do it.
Why don't I pull up a couple examples here? Where is it? I got too many browser tabs.
Oh yes, this is the luxury problem of modern age.
Yeah. Here we go. Is it this one? Yes. Okay, let's share
Oh, you
that.
found it. Let's put that on the screen here.
Yeah. So, we're talking about, while we're talking about documentation, I would also lump in example codes and starter kits. And
Oh yeah, 100%. Of course, that's part of that game. Yes.
yeah, so we'll look at Contentful and Content Stack. I think
Contentful is a great one.
Yeah, Contentful is a good example. You can see here they've got full technology guides. This is what you should expect from a lot of vendors, which is a number of different languages, including JavaScript frameworks, including stuff that's potentially server side. In a lot of cases, you may be integrating into an older enterprise application. So, or if you are, it's worth noting, okay, maybe I still have some Java stuff kicking around or .NET stuff kicking around. Let's make sure the APIs include that. What else here? So I'm going to look at a Next.js example, and let's say,
interestingly, there's not a Next SDK. There's a JavaScript SDK with TypeScript and then this is an example in Next.js. So don't expect people to build you a Nuxt or Next SDK. The SDK is just agnostic, and this is an example using it.
Yeah. And so in this case, this is a really nice example. Has some command line. Is that command line tooling? No, it's just.
No, this is just
command line functions. Yes.
Yeah. This is
create your Contentful account, hook that up.
So this is not an SDK. This is just an example of how you can use it, which is very important in documentation.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe it was a different example that I looked at that actually did have, maybe it was in React, that did have some functions. So in this case here, there's some starter code that they have for that React starter. So this is
again, that's not the SDK though. That's just how to use the SDK with React.
Yes, exactly. But all of these things kind of go together, which is helping you.
Very important.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important to do it this way, because when you look at a system like Nuxt, like a framework like that, they have this module approach. And so you can actually use, like this, here you have React. You can just use the SDK from Contentful with React and just bundle it somehow and do it. And then you can do the same with Vue. But when you go to Nuxt.js, you have this whole module approach. And so what you start to see is, also Uniform does this, specifically for Nuxt.js, they make a module to connect to Contentful. And that makes it even easier. So that's an SDK wrapped in an SDK. So that does exist. I'm sorry to say, but yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I like Contentful's examples a lot.
Yes,
they're
very
solid. Clear.
Exactly.
Good to work through. Another vendor worth looking at is Content Stack.
Wow, they have so many. That's amazing.
They have a lot as well. One thing I did want to highlight, we're talking about SDKs. There is this concept, but today we're specifically focused on content delivery SDKs. We will have another session on content management SDKs and developer tooling and things like that. So I just want to point that out, though, that when you're looking, you have different SDKs for different purposes, and then things like utilities. So this may include things like import, export, other functions.
Just for fun, that little icon at Utils SDKs in the end, is that Dart? Can you click on
Dart.
that?
Yeah.
Really? That still exists? Wow. And did they repurpose Dart for something else nowadays? I think so.
I don't know.
I was working at agency when Dart came out, and we built like a really cool thing with Dart, learning like all the it's basically TypeScript but then by Google. And it was ridiculously awesome, but also so one-off that we never did another project in it.
Yeah, I was curious about Dart.
It's
Dart
basically JavaScript 2.0 essentially.
Yeah.
But then Microsoft TypeScript just won because it fits so nicely in the JavaScript ecosystem. Anyways, this is not at all for this stream, but I was really surprised to see a Dart SDK.
Yeah. So yes, I just want to show Content Stack just to show the difference between content delivery, content management, and other utilities. And we'll talk about content management and other utilities in another session. So yeah, those were my two examples there.
Sorry to say, I know Dart is now used for building really cool mobile applications. Sorry to interrupt. I just
No, that's okay. Let's see.
You said Flutter, things like that.
Yeah.
Anyways, so we covered the docs examples and starters, but also the multi-programming languages. There's lots of CMSs that don't have SDKs in Java and PHP and all that. And then some, like we just looked at, the more enterprise focused ones, they have it for everything, which I think is really good, because enterprise projects have the strangest things you have to deal with. And so you have to be as flexible as possible or you just lose. So that's why they have this.
And I think it's also worth noting, to your point, some vendors only focus on, one or two languages. They might just have JavaScript examples and not have .NET examples or Java examples. It doesn't mean that you can't use it with those systems.
Oh, you just use an API, you query it, and you go. You just make your own SDK, essentially.
Yeah, you just have to make your own SDK. So, in the end, I think SDKs are important and helpful, but they should not be deal breakers. Is that fair to say?
Completely. Because you know what? I've had a lot of successful projects done without using the SDK. Because I just needed what I needed. And like, even when we were working at Uniform and we were building our SDK, our first one was React only. Worked extremely well. But I'm a Vue developer mainly, and I felt like, hey, I want the same convenience in Vue. So I just built my own. And that in the end, we gave that to our product team, made it 10 times better, and now that's our SDK. So you can make your own thing that just fits your use case, and then you might productize it or not. Like, and the thing is, this is the one big difference here. You can make your own SDK because you like a certain way of coding, right? The only problem is you will not get support from the CMS on your own build. So if you are in a space where SLAs mean a thing, where support, professional services mean something to you, never build your own SDK. Let them offer you an SDK or you're in for pain. It's simple as that. Because when they decide to choose an endpoint change, and they don't use like a lovely JSON schema deprecated field kind of thing, but they literally just change a field name, your website breaks and you're done and there's nothing you can do. If you have an SDK by a company, they give you, they should be able to say, hey, we changed the field, so the SDK is updated, NPM update, you're good to go.
Yep. No, that's an excellent point.
Yeah, we should have put that on the agenda, but it just came to me. Anyways.
Yeah. No, let's see. So I think that's pretty much everything from a front-end development perspective and SDKs. Let's talk about Uniform and their SDKs.
Yeah, so this is a slightly different ball game because we are not a CMS. And so we kind of get data from different places and then put it on a page, and then you have to render something. And so the Uniform SDK looks quite a lot like, I don't know, we chose certain bits and pieces from other SDKs that made sense. Like the most important thing with Uniform is it's also user generated, because it's you have data types and connections to a lot of other systems. You grab these connections and you put them on components in your preview, right? And so that means essentially the page that you create is curated based on whatever data you get. You put it in a certain order, the components look a certain way, you hit save. That means everything is user generated. So this is not like, give me all the blog post types. No, that's not what we do, right? It's a different style. You can do that with dynamic pages in Uniform, but it's not really meant for that. And so how Uniform does it is you get a whole list of components, and the names of these components, they fit also your front-end components, right? It's your design system. So it says hero variation image left with that image, with that title, with that subtitle, and that rich text. And the next component is introduction with just this text. Next component is list of blog posts. Next component, list of products, whatever. And what comes back is a list like that. Header with 3 fields, introduction, then list with 5 fields, stuff like that. And so what our SDK has to do is actually first query the composition, of course, based on the URL slug or something, whatever an ID you have. And what comes back is a list with the order of which components has which data and looks in which way. And so uniform literally just says, okay, this hero that I get back from the JSON, I can match that to the hero component in React that we just loaded. Okay, let's render that. And so the SDK of uniform actually puts the code, includes it, and puts it on the page, and then hydrates it with JavaScript or whatever happens. And it, of course, it uses the Nuxt or Next or whatever SDK endpoints you use. It understands these frameworks, so it adds the data. And so it's literally a dynamic builder and putting components together system. Well, that was a long sentence. That's a very different SDK. It looks much more like how Storyblock would do it, right? Where you have a visual editor where you put things on the page that are just components and then you just render them. Like if you wanted to do something like this with, for example, I think this content stack, they have modular blocks, right?
Yep.
Well, they don't have an SDK to render these components for you. There you just get, this is the order of the components. So what you now need to do and write in your own code is actually say, when I hit this component, I know it's that piece of code. So let's include it and put it in the JavaScript or however you render your web page. So Uniform has a pretty light SDK that just queries that composition, puts the stuff in place. But because we do it that way, there's lots of bits and pieces that you can suddenly start doing. Because when you want to do personalization, you might have 2 variations of a component. Well, that comes back into JSON, and our SDK has a sub SDK that you don't have to know about that understands personalization. So it looks at the actions the user did. Maybe there's some cookies that were saved or some session tokens, whatever. And then it chooses the right component for you. You don't have to code that yourself. And so Uniform has a light SDK that looks at whatever extra packages you have, like personalization, dynamic pages, things like redirects, a bunch of stuff like that. What else do we have there? We have like your project map, which component goes where based on what URL, things like that. And so if you don't have these installed, the SDK is lighter, but you can install them. So they're all set sub packages. And then in that one bigger function that you use, the magic happens. And even then it's really light. And because we control that whole flow of your components, preview is baked in because it's super simple that way. And so you see how that SDK is actually quite different than most CMS SDKs because it's just not a CMS. It's a designer builder thing. Okay, that was a very long way of explaining it. Did that make any sense for you, Mark?
I think it did. I think it does make more sense if you know what Uniform does, and I think you did a decent job sort of explaining up front that it's less about fetching an agnostic item and more about fetching the structure of what you've built in Uniform, and then in turn getting the items to fill into that structure, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. And so what essentially Uniform does, and this is where it gets slightly more complex, but also way more awesome, is essentially Uniform is a design system. You have your own design system, and you can, from all these external sources, you can just point to that source for that component and just pick out, let's say, the title field and the description field. I put those on my component. But the thing that Uniform stores in the Uniform system is not that information. Uniform only points for each field to where these things come from from these external systems. So it's a very light thing that's stored. And so you can actually query Uniform and just get the references, and then you query all these systems. Please don't do that, but you can. Because what Uniform then added on top, which makes it magical that I don't think any other system offers, is that on the CDN edge, we enrich all of that JSON that only points to stuff. And so we follow the pointer, query the stuff for you, put it back in, and then give you the result of everything. which means we're enhancing whatever that very simple structure is with only pointers to something real on the edge. And there's a lot of smartness going on because we cache it on the edge. We don't cache it in uniform. We don't store that stuff. We only cache it on the edge, which means you can say the time to live for this source is 30 seconds. And so every 30 seconds, when somebody hits that endpoint on the CDN edge, or the uniform SDK does that, the data is updated for just a few fields. But you can also set up a webhook that says, if in Contentful I update this content type, a webhook is sent to uniform. It has a little code with it, of course. So security stuff is there. And then uniform will find wherever that pointer is and then uncache or purge the cache just for those things on the CDN edge. And so when you uniform queries with the SDK, that edge endpoint, it's 15 milliseconds. It's ridiculously fast and it's all cached. So we don't have to connect anymore to all these systems. It just happens on publish. When you hit publish, uniform stores the skeleton data, goes to the edge, enriches it there, and then stores it.
Well, and I think while we're talking about enrichment and edge enhancing, it's probably also worth talking about personalization in that context.
Well, that also happens there.
Yeah.
But that's a different type of edge, though.
Yes.
And so we do have the information for the multiple variations of components that you might have, but that doesn't all end up in the client. So then there's another piece of edge that Uniform uses, especially, let's say you have a Next or a Nuxt app, and you run it, let's say, on Vercel or Cloudflare. There are edge workers. And these workers, there's just little functions that you can create by using something called a middleware. So every time you hit a URL, it renders the page, but then it also goes through that function. And you can change by streaming whatever the HTML was that was rendered, and then change it back so the user gets something else. Like if I'm in France and you're in Canada, we can both see a page differently from the same source, because you can change whatever happens, whatever is rendered on that page, you can change it through that middleware little edge handler function. And that's how we do personalization, which also means we have SSR-based personalization through edge handlers. And I think each personalization step is like 2 milliseconds, 3 milliseconds. So it's ridiculously fast. Like you could have 15 endpoints with different CMSs, whatever you want on one page, loads in like, I don't know, 35 to 50 milliseconds, and then personalize it completely for just me here in the countryside in France, adding another 10 milliseconds. It doesn't exist, and it's super cool.
I think it's also worth
to go too deep with this.
No, it's pretty deep, but I think it's interesting to talk about, because I think one of the thoughts from people moving from monolithic systems to composable approaches is, oh, you've got all these connections to other systems. How do I know that I can depend on all of those? And I think
you don't have to.
Exactly. That's the answer. It doesn't actually work that way. The more stuff that we push to the edge,
exactly. If it's just there on the edge, it's kind of volatile on the edge for as long as the cache exists.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. So we don't actually, let's say you have very sensitive data, right? Let's say you have a fashion campaign with models that are only allowed to be there for 2 weeks. After that, you get fined or whatever because of the rules you have with them. Well, imagine if Uniform actually stored that data on their server. Then you need to make a special SLA with Uniform that says, okay, if in these 2 weeks they're still there and somebody can still find these images, you're screwed. Right? That's very special and complicated, especially in enterprise. Uniform doesn't even care about that data. It's only, and also, let's say you query a whole data model from Contentful, right? We only store the one field that you selected in the Uniform interface, not everything. So there's no worries about having data cloned and how GDPR works with that. All the complicated stuff is just not there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's a really elegant approach, and it kind of answers a lot of the questions that people may have about moving to a composable approach and the dependencies on all those other systems.
I would honestly say it's the hardest way to build anything. Like, this is crazy complicated. Doing that, like, field by field cache purge.
Hardest way for us. Let's clarify that.
Oh yeah, not for end users. It's like, as a product company, This is the hardest thing to do, but once it works, and it does,
Yeah.
for end users, you have no worries because the Uniform SDK, even though it's that light, it's only a couple of kilobytes. It takes care of this stuff. So
Mhm.
you don't have to worry, hey, does this come from the edge or for Uniform? And do I have to do things? And of course, if you wanted to, we have hooks in every nook and cranny that you can use. Like imagine you get, this was an example I saw recently where I was querying, I think, a Notion database with all my conference talks because it's like a little database I have.
Yeah.
And the date that comes from Notion is kind of a strange parsing that I don't
Mhm.
like to show on my website because I want to do like 5 March 2022 in
Right.
like a nice way. So I need to separate things out. Well, a data source will never have it that way. So what I needed was a little hook. Is like when I get that data, I need to be able to change that little date field.
Mhm.
And then it goes to my component because I don't want to be changing that in my component itself because next week when I don't have dates like that,
Yeah.
it makes no sense to have that kind of weird logic in my component. I want the data to just be like that. And maybe the date field is not the best example, but it's one that I actually dealt with. And so
Mhm.
Uniform does have enhancers. You don't have to use them at all. I have not had to use one in a long time, other than that one date thing, to just change that parsing in code a little bit, and then the data was updated. And
Mhm.
so if you wanted to, you can. Like the idea of Uniform is it's agnostic, super light, and if you want to change something, you can change literally everything. Which makes it one of those things that's sometimes a complicated sell because every question we can answer with it depends. So you want to do it? Sure. I'll give you
Yeah.
15 reasons and 15 ways to do it. Just don't because you don't actually have to, but you can because that's the essence of enterprise software.
Yep.
Wow, that
And
was a long pitch there, but it worked, I think.
yeah, no, I think it helped um, kind of explain, both what we do and then also how how the SDK, kind of to our point earlier, the quality of the SDK and what
Yeah,
the SDK includes should really be relating very closely to what the actual software delivers and help you enable that well. And I,
yeah.
I think you explained that well.
Oh, awesome. Thanks for that.
Perfect. But
We're
at that,
coming up on time, though. I
I
think
think
we're
we're
nice and early.
yeah, I think we pretty much covered everything that we needed to cover. In some cases we've gone long. In this case, I think we've gone short because
Nice.
SDKs are pretty simple and easy to understand.
Well,
Uh,
hopefully.
even if the underlying concepts are a little complex.
Exactly.
Yeah, perfect. All right. So
All right.
at that, I think we can probably call this one done
I
and
call this
early.
one Friday afternoon beer time.
That's that's the other reason to wrap up early. Tim is in Europe, and you are definitely coming on beer o'clock, as
It's
I would
only
say.
4 p.m. I'm not.
Or
Yeah.
à
We
l'heure de bière.
so what we say in where I'm from in the Netherlands, if there's a 5 in the clock, so
Yeah.
I still have a few, like an hour.
I thought the Dutch would say biertje.
Oh yes, we do. That's the word. If you're an expat, that's the first word you learn.
Biertje. All right.
Exactly.
Well, enjoy that.
Thank
And
you.
at
Cheers,
that,
everybody.
thanks again for joining me, Tim.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.